give me the 1, 2, 3, go. Well, I want it when you're ready. We have, it's 6:59, we got 1 minute. Not yet. Yeah, when I stand up. Welcome to our third meeting for MindFit in our series of 4. We still have one more night after tonight. So again, we'll have it at 7 o'clock tomorrow night. And thank you all for joining in. Thank you for those that are here tonight. We're going to be talking about, the title is Not Your Grandpa's Electroshock Therapy. So it sounds very interesting. We will be having our video first, and then after that, Betty Rivera is going to come up and do the presentation tonight. Betty is a registered nurse. She is also our head deaconess here at church. She's a co-chair of the music committee and does many other various jobs in the church. She's in charge of our Bible study in the morning that we have at 9:30, and we are very thankful that she's here in the church, and I think you'll really enjoy the presentation that she has for tonight. So we're going to go ahead and get started with our video. Thank you.
Many people remember President John F. Kennedy for his charm and optimism. JFK was born into the prominent Kennedy family of Massachusetts, studied at Harvard, became a decorated military hero, and eventually went his way up the political ladder, defeating Richard Nixon for the presidential seat. One of his wins was the signing of the 1963 Community Mental Health Act, aimed at significantly curtailing institutionalization. On February 6, 1963, Kennedy gave a special message to Congress, stating that he planned to cut by half, within a decade or two, the 600,000 persons now institutionalized for psychological disorders. An ambitious goal no doubt related to the heavy criticism that asylums or mental hospitals had endured during that era. Yet there was another powerful factor that motivated Kennedy getting involved with mental health institutions: his sister Rosemary. For many years, she had struggled with seizures and mood swings, but despite her episodes of rage and convulsions, Rosemary was a normal, functioning individual. Nevertheless, Rosemary's father felt she was a risk, and in order to protect the family's political future and avoid embarrassment, he authorized for her to have a lobotomy, hoping that it would calm her down. After the surgery, 23-year-old Rosemary was never the same, and spent most of her years in an institution. Lobotomies, first called leucotomies, were invented in 1935 by Egas Moniz, a Portuguese neurosurgeon who went on to receive the Nobel Prize for his discovery. The neurologist Walter Freeman in the United States became the strongest advocate for this procedure. Freeman modified Moniz's technique, renamed the process lobotomy, then performed the first U.S. surgery in 1936. The next 35 years would witness more than 50,000 lobotomies conducted in the U.S., many at the hand of Dr. Freeman. It was Freeman's partner, neurosurgeon James Watts, who conducted the lobotomy on Rosemary Kennedy. In the beginning, Freeman's procedure severed the connection between the frontal lobe and thalamus. But nearly 10 years later, based on the work of Amaro Fiamberti, Freeman developed the transorbital method. In this procedure, electroshock would render the patient unconscious. Then Dr. Freeman would place an ice pick above the eyeball and hammer it through the orbital plate. Moving the pick around, he'd sever parts of the prefrontal cortex. He would then repeat the action on the other orbit as well. Honestly, Freeman's method are more akin to mutilation than neurosurgery. He lost his medical license in 1967, but by then he had personally conducted an estimated 4,000 lobotomies. 2,500 of those utilized the ice pick method. But we're talking about fairly recent history here. Let me step back into antiquity a minute, because the puncturing of the skull as a treatment for mental illness began way in the distant past. During the early history of man, mental illnesses were seen as spiritual issues, where evil spirits were trapped within the head. The method for treatment was called trepanation. This is where a hole would be drilled or scraped in the skull to allow the evil spirits to escape. Now, I'm not discounting or downplaying the existence of evil spirits in this world. I believe that supernatural and satanic forces are very real. But over the years, there have also been many atrocities perpetrated in the name of religion. Mistaking mental illness for a type of demon possession has only led to maltreatment and injustice. Around 500 BC, physicians began to suggest that mental illness was not a spiritual issue, but a brain-related problem. The big question was, what was causing this occurrence in the brain? It was speculated that the cause could be related to body fluids called the four humors. Thus, those who practice medicine turned to bloodletting and purging, a form of cleaning out and emptying the bowels. While these treatments had many negative results, one positive treatment did emerge from this era, talk therapy, and has played a significant role in the healing of many patients. During the Middle Ages, approximately 500 AD to 1500 AD, the connection between spiritualism and mental health made a resurgence. Both men and women, but primarily women, were thought to be demon-possessed, and witches. Exorcism, blistering, and even burning at the stake or hanging were typical treatments during that era. From the late 18th and 19th century, the Industrial Revolution ushered a materialistic form of thinking. With a heavy focus on capitalism, the value of an individual was determined by their ability to work. Prior to the 18th century, it was normal for mentally ill people to be taken care of by their families. But now, families were able to avoid shame and burden by putting their relatives away. The conditions for these loved ones weren't very loving. Mistreatment and abuse were prevalent. It is these factors that gave asylums a bad name and led to the eventual reformation of asylums and a push for moral and humane treatment for the mentally ill. One of the U.S. reformers was a man named Benjamin Rush, the father of American psychiatry, as some have referred to him. Rush promoted a healthier, more humane treatment of the mentally ill in institutions and lobbied for improved conditions. Notwithstanding, Rush continued to use a myriad of unconventional methods in his treatment arsenal, such as bleeding, blistering, cupping, and the poisons mercury, arsenic, and strychnine to induce vomiting and diarrhea, and would follow that up with cold baths and exercise. It is said that Abraham Lincoln's doctor, Anson Henry, used Rush's methods to treat Lincoln's depression. Lincoln would later confess that after spending a week with Henry, he, Lincoln, was the most miserable man alive. Scientific studies took a turn in the late 18th and 19th centuries as genetics began to play a role in mental illness prevention. Scientists postulated that the quality of the human population could be biologically improved by eliminating poor genetics and heredity. This idea became known as eugenics. Eugenists promoted methods such as selected breeding, involuntary sterilization, and social exclusion in order to rid society of individuals deemed unfit. Among the many who found themselves targets of the eugenics movement were the mentally ill. Laws were passed in 30 states making it legal to force sterilization on individuals deemed feeble-minded or antisocial, which resulted in the involuntary sterilization of at least 60,000 people in the U.S. by the 1970s. The 20th century gave us an Austrian neurologist named Sigmund Freud. With the science available back then, unable to fully explain what was occurring in the brain, and especially the why, Freud developed theories about human psyche using various methods to include hypnosis. Psychiatrists such as Roy Grinkert latched on to this idea of hypnosis and began to use sodium pentothal in order to place soldiers in a semi-conscious state, allowing them to relive their trauma and tell their story to get it off their shoulders. Freud demonstrated that the power of talking and making observations about one's inner life could improve symptoms of mental illness. The 20th century also introduced more radical treatments. These included electroshock therapy, ice therapy, insulin shock to induce seizures, insulin comas to purposely induce low blood sugar, and fever induction through infecting patients with bacteria such as tuberculosis and malaria. And of course, there were the dreaded lobotomies. Now, before we are too hard on our ancestors, I do have to point out that in many cases, the thinking was reasonable, but the prescription and execution of treatments lacked scientific support. In the case of trepanation, we successfully use a form of that today. Studying the four humors led to some crazy treatments. But today we know the importance of the bloodstream, and many diseases can be determined through the testing of body fluids. Electroshock therapy has been refined and proven to be effective. Even lobotomies, while no longer administered in such a careless and violent manner, have evolved into precise brain surgeries. The fact is that in many of our past treatments, we find the birth of our modern methods. And while we can never condone the inhumane procedures of the past, we can't deny that in some way, our more refined modern systems are indebted to the road they paved.
Treatment for psychiatric conditions today fall into four main categories. There's what we call psychotherapy or talk therapy, training therapies, which involve training behavior or cognition, how we think, psychopharmacology or drug treatments, and then there are what we call device therapies, where some type of instrument is used to provide some type of stimulus to the brain in order to affect brain function. And a great area of interest in research today is patient stratification, and that's a fancy term for saying what treatment is most likely to work best for this particular individual.
One of the first things that really got me thinking about seeking help and treatment was when my wife had mentioned my son was manifesting secondary PTSD issues. Even after I'd started seeking treatment, was doing aggressive counseling, had been on medication for a short while, and was involved in some other peer-to-peer work. A lot of people are just uncertain about what to do, but it was kind of the blind leading the blind.
We're not treating diagnoses, we're helping people. And so what we want to do is to be able to say, how do we best understand this person's particular challenges, the alterations in the brain that might be affecting this person's mood or behavior. Cervical cancer and head and throat cancer, the same cause. Till a couple years ago, we thought those are about the most different kinds of cancers that you can have, and actually it's the same cause. Psychiatry is in a very important transition stage now. Many of the currently available treatments that we have, particularly drug and device-based treatments are the product of serendipity. An astute clinician noticed that a drug developed for a different purpose or a treatment that a patient had for a medical problem improved their clinical condition. And so then we pursued that with a set of studies to figure out how best to use that. But it was with the knowledge that it helped, but not with the knowledge of how it helped. What we are seeking in much research today in psychiatry is to develop new treatments that are actually based upon understanding the underlying mechanism of the disease process that we're either trying to correct, or one of the amazing things about the human brain is that it is highly plastic. It's very changeable, and it has this intrinsic drive to restore what we call homeostasis, or normal balance.
When I started the journey, I thought the healing process would mean basically like I eradicate the anxious parts of me. Like somehow they get healed and they leave and it's not something I have to deal with. And what I've found is it's actually more of a welcoming those parts of me, whether it's, you know, an actual mental illness and disorder, or maybe a season where it's just heightened because of circumstances. It's the same experience in the body. It's that sense of being in a heightened state of fight, flight, or freeze, which again is a natural way of responding to threat. It's just you happen to be on overdrive. So that's when I would say, like, my senior year of college is when I had my first, like, I am aware that I suffer from anxiety. Therapy actually became a context for me to do a lot of work of, this didn't happen in a vacuum. Like, I didn't develop an anxiety disorder because it's just like my personality, or, you know, it's just like who I am. This was a way my body responded to the environment I was in order to survive.
There are always root causes, and I say causes because I don't think I've ever seen anyone struggle with a significant mental health problem where it's just one issue. It needs to be something that we're working on constantly in life. It's not just like, okay, now I feel better and so therefore my mental health is fine. No, when I think about mental health, I'm like, this is something I need to work on every day, because I want to become the best version of myself. I want to, yes, experience peace and joy to get today, but I also want to continue to grow. Oftentimes when we're struggling with pain, our reflex reaction, just like if we're touching a hot stove, is to jerk back, right? None of us like pain, and so we're going to avoid it, and that's normal, but it's not always healthy.
There's a difference between wanting the pain to stop and wanting to really be healed. In the past, when I was really struggling, I was identifying with my issues, allowing them to define me. I learned very early on how to see people through a very objective lens. They were there to meet needs. They were there to exert power over, or whatever, because that's how I was treated. Just really being able to look at a person and see them as a person was really huge for me. Continue to push on to a point where you're flourishing, and not only flourishing yourself, but helping others flourish.
You know, it's so important that we understand we all have weaknesses. We're all human beings that are broken in one way or another. And we need to, you know, just stop pretending like we're totally fine, and that if we just keep ignoring these issues and pretend like everything is fine, put a smile on my face, that they're gonna somehow go away. Oftentimes one of the big things that they're struggling with is a lack of hope. Like, I don't know where I'm gonna go with this. I don't know how I'm gonna get better. Is there even hope for me, Doc? Helping people to realize that they can get better. Helping people to realize that they're not alone. That does wonders for people. You don't have to get it together first.
It might be one of the 4 forms of treatment that we talked about, whether it's psychotherapy, device therapy, medications, or training. But there's tremendous help to be provided just through human relationships. You know, to be able to recognize when someone might be at risk of harming themselves or others, and making sure they get to help. Be willing to go with them, to help them make the call, to make the appointment.
It's exciting to see the development of treatments over the years. From those rudimentary and crude methods of the past, society has been able to carve out the modern techniques that bring health and healing every day. And the most thrilling part is that we're not done yet. In fact, we are on the verge of some incredible breakthroughs. Never before have mental health professionals had the tools available to them to more properly diagnose and treat mental illnesses than they do today. Some of these new techniques are only in their infancy and yet are already producing fantastic results, which means we may be looking at a bright future for the betterment of mental health practices. So let's take a look at some of those cutting-edge processes.
One of the important areas in psychiatry today is the study of the nature of brain alterations in a variety of psychiatric diagnoses. We need to make sure that our diagnostic categories actually have biological validity in terms of what's wrong in the brain. There have been tremendous advances in our capacity to visualize the living human brain, to be able to visualize its structure with increasingly fine detail, and to be able to visualize how its activity changes in the context of doing a variety of tasks and even thinking of certain things. We have a number of new medications that target specific brain circuits or molecules in the brain that are very promising. We have a number of different ways of what we call neuromodulation, of providing some type of external stimulus to the brain, whether it's in the form of a low-intensity electrical current or magnetic current, or even ultrasound to change the function of circuits. We have new tools in terms of cognitive therapy to help people manage their thinking so that they in turn manage their emotions better. I'll give you one example from work being done here by Dr. Rebecca Price, and it is based on the discovery in the last half dozen years that a single dose of a drug called ketamine can give a rapid relief of depressive symptoms. What she's showing is that if you combine a single dose of ketamine with a form of cognitive training that retrains the brain to associate positive feelings with the self, that the antidepressant effects of ketamine can be sustained for months. We've actually developed techniques where we can record electrical signals from the living human brain, convert those through computer algorithms into tools that can move devices, so that the people who are paralyzed, who by having their brain recorded while they're thinking of moving an arm, that signal can actually be transduced into a prosthetic arm to make it move. So it's just fascinating and staggering how our understanding of the human brain continues to grow. But it's one thing to say that we know how the sensory motor system works, and it's another thing to say that we understand how thought and feeling work in the brain. We're still in an early phase, and we're actually not even sure how early a phase we're at in terms of actually being able to visualize, record, quantify the brain functions that go into our deepest abilities to think and feel and reason and make judgments.
The history of mental illness treatments demonstrates a tension between the acknowledgement of the abnormal and the mystery of human function. The fact is that humans are extraordinarily complex, and despite our modern advances, we still struggle to understand the how and whys of the way we work. At times, and especially for our ancestors, the best we could do is simply compare people to our accepted societal norms, and if they didn't fit, declare that they were not normal. Early on, At least in the case of those that didn't pose a threat to themselves or others, society was content to provide as much freedom to the mentally ill as possible, most being cared for by their families. Capitalism and industrialization brought this to an end, in that now the value of a man was more linked to their wallets than anything else. Those who could not produce were viewed as undesirables. This new movement brought the need for institutions where the mentally ill could be locked away for the benefit of themselves, their families, and society as a whole. The early asylums were crude and inhumane and gave institutionalization and mental illness a bad rap. However, over time, much needed reform took place, and the asylums of old slowly transformed into the professional mental hospitals we know today. Now, while we lament the way the mentally ill were treated in the past history, especially those that were institutionalized, scholars tell us that the birth of mental illness coincided with the institutions. You see, before this, mental illness was just scattered incidents around the globe. There was no way to determine the extent of mental illness, no concerted effort to study behavior in the mind, and no processes to test and develop treatments. Institutions, because they brought numerous mentally ill people together in one place, brought attention to the grand scope of the problem and provided a location where observation and research could evolve knowledge and treatments, giving us what we have today. While we're not there yet, and continued research and development is needed in all fields of mental health, great strides have been taken since the days of old. Today, many solid options exist for the mentally ill that, for many, can provide lifelong relief for the issues that torture them and the ones they love. While many of the treatments of our forefathers were misplaced or incorrect, in truth, they did the best they could with the knowledge they had. Honestly, I marvel at how much they got right, including their linking between spiritual forces and mental health. Remember trepanation, the practice of boring into the skull in order to free the evil spirits, which some say goes back as far as 6,000 plus years ago. And then there was the revival and fixation of spiritual causes in the Middle Ages, where it was believed that the mentally ill were possessed or even witches, leading to exorcisms and prayer rituals and even executions. Well, like the other methods that were rooted in some truth, but executed poorly, it appears that there's something to this spiritual element as related to mental illness, just not quite like our ancestors believed. You see, the ancients, up to our forefathers, emphasized the spiritual realm as responsible for the mentally ill, specifically that people were possessed by evil spirits. They were fixated on this and naturally conjured up ways to cast the demons out, isolate the ill, and even dispose of the possessed. But what if they were simply looking at the wrong thing? What if they had become so tunnel visioned that they misplaced causation, leading to an incorrect diagnosis, which in turn produced the wrong treatment? It turns out that spiritual treatments, when coupled with the more traditional scientific and new technological breakthroughs, are actually a powerful tool towards mental fitness and the healing of mental illness. Join me next time for Binding Up the Brokenhearted, the link between your spiritual and mental health. Until then, God bless.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight. Wasn't that a fascinating video? It was just amazing to see the history of the treatment throughout time. It's beginning with trepanation and then all the way to today, to the different technology that we have and how mental illness is being treated today. So it's just really fascinating. What I'm going to do is we're going to go over your guide number 3, Not Your Grandpa's Electroshock Therapy. So just open to page, your study guide, to the first page there. We have 8 questions, and we'll go through those with some answers there for you. So the story of Rosemary Kennedy is really pretty tragic. And despite some of the intellectual challenges and her later struggles with violent mood swings, She was far from needing a full-on lobotomy to help with her issues. But the doctors insisted, and her father agreed. So this was, she was born in 1918, and she was JFK's younger sister. And in 1941, she had that lobotomy. So after her lobotomy, Rosemary was severely injured, and she had the mental capacity of a small child. She could no longer participate in family activities, and she would spend the rest of her life institutionalized. Now, it's believed that this specific tragedy inspired her siblings to champion the fight against mental illness. President Kennedy, as you saw in the video, he initiated major changes to the ways Americans with disabilities were treated, and he promised to cut by half those who were currently institutionalized. Eunice Kennedy Shriver started a program that eventually became the Special Olympics. And Jean Kennedy Smith founded Very Special Arts, VSA, to promote creative arts opportunities with those who had disabilities. But back to Rosemary's father, Joseph Kennedy. It's reported that Rosemary's post-surgery plight was kept secret for many years, and even her siblings did not find out about her condition until 20 years later. So, number one in your guide here, it says, what role does guilt play in our actions and decisions as human beings? Well, we all experience guilt in some form or another, and guilt is a heavy burden to bear. It tends to keep people quiet, either due to embarrassment or a sense of unworthiness. Now, in the account of King David in 2 Samuel chapter 13, verse 121, David fails to take action against his son for the rape of Tamar. David loved his son so much because he was the firstborn. But there's also a good chance that David probably felt a little bit guilty over his own sexual sin with Bathsheba to hand down judgment. And in the case of Rosemary Kennedy and countless others with mental conditions, her family's guilt and embarrassment led them to conceal and to exclude her. Yet, while Joseph Kennedy sought to hide his quote-unquote problem child away, her siblings later recognized her and her struggle, and they championed the rights of people like her. So it's possible the advocacy, too, was motivated by guilt, remorse over neglecting Rosemary. But sometimes guilt can inspire us to do better. So guilt can be so overwhelming that it causes people to do the unthinkable, such as taking their own lives, because they feel unworthy due to what they've done, or because they don't want to receive the penalty for their choices. As in the case of Judas in the Bible, he hanged himself after realizing that he had betrayed Jesus and that Jesus wasn't going to save himself. Now, in today's society, there's a strong push to treat mental illness just as seriously and humanely as physical illness. Do you think that this focus on mental health is due more to increased awareness of the issues at hand, or more to guilt and a deep urge to atone for the many atrocities of the past treatments? Does the exact motivation behind the change really matter? That's number 2 in your guide. So there are a lot of factors that could come up that we can consider. Now, the video talked about asylums. The care for mental illness has been happening in some form or another, but for much of history, it was hidden behind closed doors. It was the asylums that gave society an opportunity to see how widespread mental health conditions were, and it resulted in an awakening and concentrated medical efforts to treat them. Of course, these institutions saw abuses and bad practices as well, but their more public nature led to a wider exposure and closer scrutiny. The harsh 2020 hindsight of history has resulted in intense societal shame over some of the flaws and failings of asylums. You know, when you think of an asylum, you think of a place of refuge, a place of refuge when you're seeking help. There were a lot of different shameful things that occurred in asylums. Now, pharmacy, big pharma and psychiatry was not a prominent or prestigious medical field at first. It wasn't until the 20th century pharmaceutical industry, aided by government and academic partnerships, began pouring money into meds and research that the field was elevated, and labs went from the basement of an institution to the top floor. This paved the way for much-needed research, broader and better treatments, increased profits, and a massive industry presence in the socio-political economy resulting in what we know today. Now, war. In the 1900s, we witnessed major worldwide conflicts, and these wars resulted in millions of soldiers grappling with severe mental issues. You've heard of the term shell shock, and that was the name that was first given in World War I to what was essentially what we know today as post-traumatic stress disorder in soldiers. Pressed by the need to treat active troops and veterans and to screen potential recruits for conditions, the governments and the doctors then got to work. Thus, huge strides in understanding mental illness were made as a result of war. For instance, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, that's DSM, that's used by just about every modern psychiatrist today. It was originally developed using World War II era military classification schemes. Now, recent factors such as the alarming prevalence of mental illness, that's 1 in 8 people worldwide and 1 in 5 in the U.S., famous figures sharing openly about their struggles, growing violence in our society, emerging breakthroughs, technologies, and digital tools, and so on, have all contributed to a rise in awareness and education. As in previous times, there are always triggers that yank the conversation back into the spotlight. That this is a common reality of human life. The squeaky wheel gets the grease. Now, the procedures of Dr. Freeman were violent and savage, those lobotomy procedures. You saw that on the video there. That's just amazing that he'd use an ice pick to go into the brain, into the frontal lobe, and do that procedure. But it was totally out of place, one would think, in a reasonable and an educated society. However, history is filled with such abuses. Think of the medieval church deploying brutal torturers to correct those who didn't toe the line, or the many scientists of modernity who forced unwilling test subjects to endure excruciating pain and sickness. It has happened in every age. In John 11:49 through 50, the Bible records the words of the high priest Caiaphas while he and his comrades plotted to kill Jesus. He says, "It is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and not the whole nation should perish." In Caiaphas's estimation, killing a man who had done nothing wrong, a man who had given evidence of being the divine Son of God, was better than losing their place and position in society. In other words, he proposed murder for the greater good. So number 3 in your guide, it says, in what ways does this concept of the greater good sometimes lead us to do unthinkable things? Well, the problem with the greater good lies at the foundation, namely, who is laying that foundation? Who's in charge of deciding and dictating what the greater good is? In the story of Caiaphas, he and the Jewish leaders made a decision based on what they felt was best for the whole. And this was driven by their understanding of the Messiah and what he meant for the future of their nation. Now, Jesus wasn't the political conqueror that they thought the Messiah would be. Jesus regularly criticized them as hypocrites, and he undermined their authority as leaders of Israel. But he was so popular, they feared that Rome might think him a threat and that they would punish the whole nation and rob them, the leaders, of their power. So Jesus had to decide, they had to die. That was their decision. They decided it was for the best. So today, who decides? The question looms large today. Who decides what is good, best, fair, and just? Does society decide by democratic means? Do the politicians decide based on how they read the needs of the populace? Do the courts decide? Does economics drive our decisions? When industrialization and capitalism became the name of the game, they demanded that every able-bodied man and woman would work, produce, and contribute to society from a monetary perspective. This left no one to take care of the mentally ill, and it also labeled the mentally ill as unproductive and less valuable in the sight of society. But was that morally right? And that brings us to the next big question. Who or what is the moral compass for our world? Who can we really trust? So Mark 5, 1 through 5 records this story. We're going to take a look at the Bible. Then they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gadarenes. And when Jesus had come out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit who had his dwelling among the tombs. And no one could bind him, not even with chains, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains. And the chains had been pulled apart by him, and the shackles were broken in pieces. Neither could anyone tame him, and always, night and day, he was in the mountains and in the tombs, crying out and cutting himself with stones. Now, although this story is truly about demon possession, the actions of the demoniac could have easily been seen as a result of mental illness. So, number 4, why not discounting the realities of spiritual forces at play in the world today? While not discounting the realities of spiritual forces at play in the world today, what dangers lie in assuming that an individual is demon-possessed and not mentally ill? So, physical illnesses and spiritual illnesses, while they may share commonalities, they're separate diseases. We couldn't imagine telling an ambulance carrying a heart attack patient to take them to the nearest church instead of the hospital. While we certainly would ring up the prayer chain and plead the mercies of heaven, the patient needs to be seen by professional doctors. Too often, mental illness has been treated as a spiritual issue instead of a physical or physiological and medical issue. People will tell those who are suffering from mental conditions that they need to practice greater confession, repentance, prayer, faith, and Bible reading, just to name a few. But that often results in their discouragement and not encouragement. So surely these things are of great value, but a mentally ill individual needs professional medical intervention. Number 5, why are solutions such as pray more, study the Bible more, go to church more, etc., not always the best remedy for mental illness? Well, again, medical conditions need medical assistance. To push the spiritual solution is a recipe for despair and may end up alienating the individual from God altogether. If someone is told that God is the solution and they do all that has been advised, and yet they find themselves still mentally ill, this can contribute to a very awkward picture of God and his love. It could be just skewed, So in many cases, a person won't be able to exercise a greater, stronger faith until they're at a place where their mental distress is under control. Now, this has been an eye-opener for me, this whole mini-series, because I have a friend who struggles with depression, and I couldn't really understand why she couldn't do anything in the house, why she couldn't do her cooking anymore, why she couldn't attend to the needs of her family anymore. And I would think in my mind, well, you know what? Maybe she just needs some Bible study. Maybe that's what we need, read the Bible together and pray together. And although that's all very good, they still need the medical intervention. So in Genesis chapter 3, God walks through the garden looking to have a conversation with Adam and Eve. This is a pattern of God's greatest desire. He searches for us because he wishes to dwell with us and for us to dwell with him. He delights in conversing with us, and he says in John 16:24, "Until now you have asked nothing in my name. Ask, and you will receive, that your joy may be full." And in Revelation 3:20 we read, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and dine with him, and he with me." So number 6, while there are many bizarre treatments for mental afflictions, those that were tried in ancient days, that trephination and poking holes in people's skulls to let out all the evil spirits, there is one treatment that the video did talk about that did prove effective, and it's still being used today. It's talk therapy. In what ways is communication a powerful healer for us? Does communication for you enable you to receive help? Communication is really important. Now, there were 2 doctors, Roy Baumeister and Mark Leary, and they wrote an article in 1995 that was published in the Psychological Bulletin. And they wrote, "Human beings are fundamentally and pervasively motivated by a need to belong." We all want to belong. That's a strong desire to form and maintain enduring interpersonal attachments. Of course, that's been apparent long before modern science. The fact is, we are social creatures, and we've been created that way. God created that way. Number 1, talking and sharing play a huge role in the development of our interpersonal relationships. Imagine a young couple trying to get to know each other, but they never talk or communicate in any way, not one word. The chances of that relationship flourishing are slim to none. We get to know each other by communicating, and when we have trusted relationships, then we're able to, quote, let our hair down. We can speak freely about the things that are going on in our lives with somebody we trust. And number 2, communication allows us to get the stuff off of our shoulders, to get rid of those burdens. So keeping things bottled up tends only to suffocate us more. Think of it like a suitcase. There's only so much space in that suitcase, and once it's full, it's full. We simply can't live life lugging full suitcases everywhere we go. Not only would it be heavy, but there'd be no space for new thoughts, ideas, and dreams. Now, over the centuries, millions of people have immigrated to the United States to pursue the American dream of freedom and prosperity. Developments in technology, industry, and politics have made this dream a reality for many. And the same goes for plenty of other countries around the world that have become democracies and financial powerhouses. These are societies built around hard, honest work and the ability to craft your own success. But while that ability is a treasured freedom, the way it has evolved has had some drawbacks. Number 7, what changes resulting from industrialization and capitalism have negatively affected our society and the mentally ill specifically? And what can we do as a society to promote freedom, advancement, and prosperity while not sacrificing compassion and our duty to each other? Well, In the United States and in other big capitalist countries, you can have just about anything you want. Is that right? Here in the United States, you can have just about anything that you want, but there's a condition there. It's as long as you pay for it. So you work to earn money, to buy the things you need to live. But those things are costly, and you can't predict every need that will arise. So there's all the taxes, there's the fees, the debts. So you work more every day, grinding out a living. But it's a vicious cycle. You need money, so you make money. Then you spend money. Then you need money, you make money, and you spend money, and the loop goes around until you die, or at least retire if you happen to have a nest egg built up. But this world is a frenzy of working, buying, selling, and just planning to try to survive. So as a result, here's 4 points. We become very self-centered and self-occupied, and we don't have much time to notice, let alone address the issues that are around us, including mental illness. The second one is we ourselves are all susceptible to mental struggles because the rat race is taxing on our minds and our bodies. When we are just struggling to survive every day, we are susceptible to all of those mental struggles. Now, thirdly, the business of life leaves little time to care for those in our own family circles because in order to live, you have to work. And mostly, it's working a lot. And fourthly, those who are struggling can become a burden because not only do they need extra attention, but they can't contribute as much to the needs of the family. Now, there's a Bible verse here in 1 Timothy 6:10, and it says, "For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil." Now, there's nothing wrong with making a living and being financially and materially prosperous, but the problem arises when society values these things above the well-being of others. The value of a person should not be measured by what they're able to produce or how much they have, but by the fact that they are a being created in the image of God. Value should not be measured intrinsically. It should be measured intrinsically for what's inherent in you, for what is natural, for what is within, but not extrinsically, not from the outside, what people add to you. So breaking the rat race towards prosperity is a challenge, and 2 things would help. Number 1, educating the young that there is more to life than just the collection and the enjoyment of stuff. Because true happiness cannot be found in amassing fortunes and building our own personal kingdoms, but building family and relationships and altruistic or unselfish generosity are the keys to real success and satisfaction. Number 2, educating our society that our economic priorities are creating generations who value items more than people. We live in a world saturated with buying and selling, with advertising, with profits and schemes. Now, it's true that where there is a need or a desire, there will always be a market. But it's also true that if we don't know or think about it, if we don't value it, we won't want it. Responsible, moral capitalism seems like an oxymoron, like a contradiction. But could there be room for some of these conversations in our society? Something to think about. Now, in the 18th and the 19th centuries, scientists began to think or postulate that mental disease was hereditary. If somebody wanted to eliminate it, well, then the treatment was simple. Don't let the mentally ill reproduce. Family trees and genealogies were consulted, resulting in the institutionalization of not just the patient who was ill, but also the family members who it was thought that they were the ones who contributed to the mental illness. The later eugenics, they talked about eugenics in the video, that movement led to countless more crimes and horrors, because eugenics was a theory that improving the human race would be by selective breeding of the population. But more recently, brain scans have garnered much attention. Maybe with enough scans, the thinking goes, we could see and understand patterns to help us not only treat what's currently going wrong with an individual, but also to determine what could potentially go wrong. But number 8 asks the question, what dangers are there in projecting someone's potential future actions and illnesses through modern methods such as scans, or even today's hot-button topic, artificial intelligence? So the brain is so very complex, and we know so little about the human brain that to make assumptions, even educated assumptions, could prove to be disastrous. And the question is, where does it stop? There's been some research done on suicide and the possibility that scans could determine if someone is suicidal or may be prone to suicide. But what do we do with that kind of information? Do we take action based on just scans? How much weight would we give to a person's word versus a machine's data? Let's say our scanning technology increases and we believe that we can determine if someone's likely going to commit a crime. Do we arrest them based on something that we think might happen in the future? The ethical dilemmas escalate as technology advances. The big question is, who governs the moral use of technology? Who's going to decide what is appropriate? Who's going to decide what is fair or ethical regarding the use of new scientific technology? Well, the answer remains to be seen. But we always need to strive to be wise and compassionate and intelligent as we deal with mental illness, because it's always going to be around us. May we keep an open mind, and may we be alert to the signs, especially of those that we are the closest to, the ones in our family, our friends, our neighbors, our co-workers. So that ends our presentation for tonight, but tomorrow night, which will be the final one, is Binding Up the Brokenhearted. Thank you for joining us tonight. I hope that there was something that you saw on the video or something that you heard in the presentation that will help you to be more aware of mental illness and how you can play a part in helping others. So at this time, we'll pray. Our loving Father God, thank you so much for bringing this condition of mental illness to our attention. And thank you for the treatments and therapies that are being used today. But most importantly, Lord, may we have the compassion that is needed. May we have the wisdom, may we have the knowledge to be able to identify the signs and the symptoms that may be in people around us, the ones that are closest to us. And may we use this knowledge and this wisdom to help others. Thank you, dear God. We ask this all in Jesus' name. Amen.